So, greetings, everyone. My name is Norbert Morvan, and today I am speaking with Raphael Kaplinsky, the Emeritus Professional Fellow, the Institute of Development Studies, the University of Sussex. Greetings to you, Rafi. You've spoken about how the world undergoes techno-economic paradigms centered on a technology that revamps the economy, such as water power, steam power, most recently mass production. Within mass production, deep globalization, quote unquote, with its global value chains, overcame the crises of profitability in the 1970s. And you've also mentioned the crises of deep globalization and the shift towards a more localized production based on a new information and communication technology, Techno-Paradigm, ICT. So, how does Trump's current tariff war fit in with this framework, in your opinion?
Okay. Just before I get to the specifics of Trump and what's happening in the current era, just to
Mm.
go back a bit to the big picture, uh, the argument is that since the Industrial Revolution, we've had four long waves. We call them techno-economic paradigms, and you describe them as water, coal, steel, and mass production. True, but these paradigms were not just technologies. They were socio-technical paradigms. So with each of these waves, it wasn't just there was the dominant technology that went through the system, there was a political structure to support it, there were forms of governance and control, there were value systems, there were the way people live. And so we should really not, techno-economic paradigms is a bit misleading. We're talking about social systems within which there were technology and economic patterns as well. So that's just the general picture. To go to your specific point, how does this help us understand Trump and what's happening at the moment and the crisis we're in? Okay, so I'm going to narrow the big picture of the shift from one paradigm to another paradigm to address your specific point, and I want to pull out a number of things which are relevant and which arise from the degradation as were the end of the mass production paradigm which dominated the 20th century. Number one, the importance of the financial sector, financialization, money, short-termism thinking, and the gambling economy. Very, very important, particularly in the USA, to some extent Europe, but right through the formerly dominant Western economies, the financial sector has got out of control. Finance has an important role to play, but the particular type of financialization we've had is a financialization of gambling, short-termism, and is associated with a massive increase in inequality since 1980. Hasn't been seen since the 1920s. And that increase in inequality is not just an increase in unequal incomes, it's an increase also in the inequality of power. And we have a growing concentration of power reflected in the power to control the narrative of what's going on in the world. I'll come back to that. Also, economic concentration, the power of very large corporations, and in particular, the concentration of power in the tech sector. So the first part of our mass production is financialization. The second one is around inequality and concentration. The third one is that since mass production sustained itself by shifting production to China and other developing countries, the rich countries have experienced blowback. That is, unintentionally, they created industrial capabilities and technological capabilities in developing countries. And it's no longer the case that developing countries are just at the bottom of the technological frontier and knowledge. Increasingly, developing countries, particularly in East Asia, have growing competences as well. So that was associated with growing competences in developing countries, massive increase in exports to the rich countries of physical products, coupled with technological change, led to growing unemployment in the rich countries, not just unemployment, but precarity, that is the insecurity, and industrial decay. So you have this real decline of the social fabric, which was an intrinsic part of mass production. Then you get the rise of the populists. And the populist story is a story against elites. Now, they tell a lie because the populists are uniformly all from the elite themselves. But through their control of the narrative, they spin a story that somehow they are able to reverse these unfortunate tendencies, which are a consequence of the dominance of the elites. And they do that by controlling the narrative. And this isn't just an accident. Right from the 1980s through the 1990s and now, the extreme right have put enormous amount of resources into telling the story that this is somehow, they represent those who've been victims of globalization, and they're in struggle against the elites who gain from globalization. Of course, it's a lie, because yes, elites have gained and the population have lost, but the people who are controlling the narrative, the populists, are actually part of the elite spinning this massive lie. So all of this occurs in the context of gales of creative destruction. That is, the old system doesn't work anymore, right? There's a new system coming out there, and the words of gales of creative destruction are the Austrian economist Schumpeter, and the words speak for themselves. It destroys the old, which is no longer feasible, but it creates manifold opportunities for the new. And so the politics story is to spin a lie that we can somehow go back to the old days. In the old Soviet Union, they want to go back to a form of Stalinism. I don't know how many of your audience have been to the old Soviet Union in the last 20, 30 years, but many people hanker for Stalinism because the old Soviet system gave security, gave healthcare, and it wasn't a world of precarity. So in the old socialist bloc, reversion to the past is a story which talks about stability, security, moving away from the fragility of the new order. But in the rich countries, and in America in particular, the narrative is somehow, if only we can go back to the past, if only we can go back to the past, everybody will be happy the way we were. So what does Trump do? He destroys everything that he can put his hands on, which reflects the transition to a new order. Renewable energy, gone. New forms of technology, and I'll come to this later on, gone. It's basically, you know, the phrase reactionary, returning to the past. And that sparks for those people who've lost their livelihoods, who grew up in a world where the world was predictable, where automobiles were running on petroleum, and where there were no problems. It's such a comfortable story. So I think that tells the story of how Trump and other populists have come to power. Now, just one last point, which is where it's all heading at the moment. The Big Beautiful Bill is actually a massive redistribution of income from the rich to the poor. Should I say that again? The Big Beautiful Act is a massive redistribution from the poor to the rich. And it's funded by tariffs. Tariffs, the story about tariffs is it will bring back jobs to America, which it may or may not. But the story for Trump, and he believes that the revenue which tariffs give will somehow pay for the tax cuts for the rich. So that's one agenda. Unfortunately, it runs against the interests of the oligarchs, the techno oligarchs, who came to support him. They don't want a closed world. They don't want a world of tariffs and closeness. And when are these two things going to collide? They collided with Musk and Trump, but at some stage, the oligarchs are going to get to their heads together and say, look, this guy is dangerous. He's dangerous for other reasons as well. He's dangerous because he has his finger on a nuclear button, but he's dangerous also because his unpredictability in the context of this financial crisis is undermining the basic tenets of economic growth. And so the big issue now is, will the chickens come home to roost before the midterm elections next year? The Republicans have delayed the cuts in the health program till after the midterm elections, but that's not helping them the whole way, because many of the health companies are anticipating these changes, and many of the hospitals in the rural areas where Trump had a big following are anticipating that they're not going to be able to manage without the healthcare support. So there's a race between, can Trump and his mates, mostly male, can they destroy democracy in time before the next presidential election? And unfortunately, there's a real possibility there. You know, the real victim in all of this isn't poor people, it's the erosion of democracy in America. So on his hands, he's got growing inflation, he's got the crisis in healthcare and also in food stamps. I don't know if you read Krugman at all, but Krugman's blogs are really interesting on this. He's got an incipient rebellion by the techno oligarchs. And how will that coalition pan out? One last point. We must not personalize this. Trump is a front man. He's a comic, he's a fool, but people believe his story. He doesn't have the brains to pursue an agenda. And there are a group of people out there pulling the strings behind the scene who I think are the real problem. And, you know, you may not like Trump, and you may wish that he might get ill, but be careful what you wish for. So it's a very unfortunate world. Sorry, that's a long answer. Don't know whether that helps you at all.
This is why we brought you here, sir. Well done, well played. Your mellifluous voice is just a bomb. I love it, man. I love it. The last question that I have for you, sir, could you please elaborate a little bit more on the ICT techno-paradigm, at least because you said it's not exactly a techno-paradigm.
Exactly.
So if you could elaborate on that, give us the potential, the pitfalls, and how can left and progressive forces give some kind of directionality and focus to the paradigm as you're going to describe it?
Okay, we have to go back a bit onto the big story. The first paradigm was the introduction of the factory system and water power. So you had the first factories and production being brought from the home into organized factories. The market was essentially a market which was at the end of canals, so it was limited. You had a growth in scale, but it was essentially local. The second paradigm was steam power. And what steam power did wasn't so much that steam was more efficient than water, which to some extent it was, but steam gave you railways. And with railways, the market widened from the factory and the village and the small local town to the national arena. The third wave was the wave of steel and heavy engineering. Now, steel meant that you could carry heavier loads on railroads, and railroads were no longer just railroads within a narrow remit of production. You could go across continents. You could go across Europe, and you could go across North America. Allied to that, steel gave you steel-hulled ships, and you had internationalization with telegraphy in the 19th century, so that by the end of the 19th century, the world was as integrated as it was at the end of the 20th century, of a different type of integration. But as you can see, we were now beginning in a world order. Mass production was around Henry Ford. You've already said you can have a Model T Ford in any color you like, as long as it's black. And the age of mass production was one of massive growth in scale and an infrastructure fueled by carbon, by petroleum, the motor car, the growth of suburbs, suburbanization, and mass consumption. Because of the scale, production and consumption were increasingly separated. It made sense to produce in whole towns in China. One of the famous towns in China produced 80% of the world's buttons and 70% of the world's zips. And that was reflected across a range of different sectors. You produced in China to consume in America and Europe. And perhaps the best example of that is energy. You took energy out of the ground in Saudi Arabia. You shipped it in very large ships all around the world. You put it in refineries, massive refineries, which then went to power stations, which are massive and concentrated, and to feeding the automobilization of society across the system. Everything associated with scale. Think of renewable energy. With renewable energy, you can produce energy wherever you need it. You don't have to take it out the ground in Saudi Arabia, transport it to America into a big refinery, and ship it all the way around North America. You can produce the energy where you need it. And this revolution in energy generation is a metaphor for the change of the future. Globalization is a story of mass production. We produce in these massive factories in China, we ship them all around the world. What happens if these massive factories are no longer necessary? That is, if we can have decentralized production. I'm not suggesting for a moment that all production of buttons and zips will return to America. Of course they won't. There will still be production in the South, which is destined for northern markets. But as a central trajectory, the system is moving from centrifugal, spreading out, to centripetal, which is drawing closer to the fore. So a dominant phenomenon we're observing at the moment is the growth of regionalism and regional trade and South-South trade. So it's more likely that you will have an Asian production system, which is close to an Asian market, and a North American, Latin American production system, which is closer to American consumers, and European and North Africa, and growing South-South trade between China and Africa and China and Latin America. So all of this, and I don't have the time to talk about it, all of this is furthered and made possible by digital technologies. And again, note, this isn't just a story about technologies, it's a story about who is employed, where they're employed. And one of the crucial parts about the decentralization of production is the efficiency of the decentralization of decision-making and power. So that industrial policy now moves from Washington, from London, from Paris, from Bonn, from Beijing, to the regions, to more decentralized areas. And in these decentralized areas, localization becomes very important. So 2 points I want to make. Firstly, the power of civil society comes from the growing economic efficiency of the local. And I think that is what civil society has to build on. We have more and more power to organize and work at the local, because that is where the system needs to go. Very, very important. It's a story of power, what type of power and who controls power. But there's also a bigger story. So that's your central concern, I know. But the bigger story as human beings we all have to think about is the directionality of the digital technologies. Now, one of the most frightening TED, well, it wasn't a TED talk, but a TED-type talk I've seen, was of a young entrepreneur dressed hippily on a stage with an adoring audience, clapping in admiration, and he's telling them that his company has 2 crucial bits of technology. They have the capacity of facial recognition, and they have programmable robots, which are so small that they can put 2 grams of dynamite in, and they can blow out the brains of anyone, anywhere in the world by hunting them down without killing the person next to them. The most chilling video I've seen. That is not the direction which we want the digital technologies to take. The digital technologies, there are manifold opportunities for improving the life of poor people. In Africa, the digital technologies have enabled rural people and urban people to send money all over the world, to buy in small amounts, not to have cash so they're not subject to predation. Digital technologies give us the capacity to deliver by drone medicines to far distant regions. Digital technologies give us the capacity to farm in a much more intelligent and sustainable way. There are so many opportunities, which I've outlined in my book, incidentally, published in 21. There are so many opportunities opened up for a more sustainable world by digital technology. And we have to move the innovation machine away from militarization, away from technologies which reinforce the power of the rich, the wealthy, and to move it in ways which provide for a more sustainable and global world. Now, my colleague in the UK, I don't know if you know Mariana Mazzucato, you know, she uses the phrase, she's the one who coined the phrase directionality. And she says we need a more mission-oriented approach. The good example Mariana gives is in 1960, when President Kennedy came to power, he said, within a decade, we're going to send a man to the moon. And you know what? Not only did America send a man to the moon, men incidentally, not women, they got them back as well. And they did that by having a focus around a big issue and bringing together an assortment of stakeholders, government and the private sector, different ministries of government, different types of the private sector, and in some cases, civil society, around 4 or 5 big goals. We did it with COVID. Robert Kennedy and Trump are trying to undo that, but they showed us that we are able to do that. We are able to do that. So my message is on directionality. We have to give direction to the new order. We must make sure, and that's a story of big innovation, but giving direction also means working at it from below. Henry Ford said, I pay my workers to work, not to think. Henry Ford was the architect of mass production. That is no longer efficient. Forgive me, that's my dogs. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not sure whether they were agreeing with me or disagreeing with me, but that's my story.
I really appreciate you and everything that you said. Just the world of precarity, the fact that Amazon's about to lay off 35,000 white collar workers and just give their jobs to AI. The precarity is really so important. And the gatekeeping of the oil and the resources is why they refuse to switch to renewable energy, because you can't gatekeep the sun, for Christ's sake.
No, it's a bad book.
So,
Do you know the work of Robert Reich?
I've heard the name.
So
I do
Robert
know.
Reich wrote a
Yes.
famous book in which he spoke about, it's called not The Wealth of Nations, which Adam Smith's book was called, it's called The Work of Nations. And he says, writing in the 1990s, of course, America's got an underclass, and by definition, on top of every underclass, working class, is a ruling class, an upper class. In the middle, we no longer have a middle class, we have an anxious class. And that anxiety and precarity is the politics of populism.